So I think if you're interested in global policy, if you're interested in your stance and how the world is working around you and how that impacts you, I think this is a very, very important podcast, right? Ultimately, you don't live in your own economy by yourself. You're living in a competitive environment. And whatever happens somewhere else in the world, it impacts you in one way or the other, maybe with massive delays, but it impacts you. So being educated about global policy, being educated about international economics is critically important to see where you stand in the world and what affects you and how you can actually monetize that. So that's what I would argue is how critical to this. Number two is any podcasts and podcasts which are a great way of becoming more in tune with the industries and segments that you're in and learning from other people's experiences, right? Is to build a larger library of experience knowledge. And you don't have to experience everything yourself, but you can actually read about it and learn from other people's experiences. So that's why podcasts become so critically important.
Before we dive back into today's conversation, I want to share something important. This episode includes a paid partnership with BetterHelp, a platform designed to make starting therapy easier. I know from my own journey as a leader and entrepreneur that life can sometimes feel overwhelming. There are seasons where stress, uncertainty, and pressure build up, and you need a safe space to process it all. That's where therapy comes in. Therapy isn't only for people facing clinical challenges. It's a space to reflect, grow, and find better ways to manage stress, relationships, and personal goals. It takes courage to seek help, but it's also one of the smartest investments you can make in your mental and emotional well-being. That's why I'm proud to highlight BetterHelp. With BetterHelp, you simply fill out a short questionnaire and get matched to a credentialed therapist in just a couple of days. If the first match doesn't feel like the right fit, you can easily switch therapists at no extra cost until you find someone who truly connects with you. Inside the platform, you'll also find tools like journaling and group sessions on different topics that can support your growth. And with over 7,000 reviews and a 4.5 Trustpilot rating, BetterHelp is a platform you can rely on. So if you feel like you'd benefit from talking to a therapist, visit betterhelp.com/KingDames. That's betterhelp.com/KingDames to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Once again, this is a paid partnership with BetterHelp, and I encourage you to take that first step if you've been thinking about it. Sometimes the best investment you can make is in yourself.
Welcome to the King Dems podcast, where we share the stories of extraordinary people and dissect hot, relevant topics that shape our world. From visionary leaders to trailblazing creatives, we uncover the mindset, strategy, and grit behind greatness. Whether it's business, culture, or personal growth, we ask the real questions. This isn't just conversation, it's transformation. The King Dems podcast. Your next breakthrough starts here.
Music licensing reimagined.
We're live, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, welcome to the King Dems podcast and Diary of a CFO. Today, I've got with me a very, very important guest, fighting out of New York by way of Washington, D.C., United States of America. Big welcome, Babak Hafezi. How are you, Babak?
Good. Thank you. Wow. Now I feel like I'm boxing. The lights are missing.
Whoa, that is the Bruce Buffer introduction. Yeah, that's mixed martial arts, you know. Life is a fight anyway, so you're welcome to the
That's
economic
right.
fight. Wow,
That's
so
right.
I've actually prepared your fantastic introduction based off your fantastic profile. So sit back and let me give you your flowers. Today
Appreciate it.
on the King James podcast and Diary of a CFO, we are joined by a global business strategist whose advice has shaped Fortune 500 CEOs, governments, investors, and entrepreneurs across continents. From guiding Morgan Stanley during the Groupon IPO to advising international governments and scaling companies worldwide. Babak Hafezi is a true authority in strategy, risk, growth, and international market expansion. As a founder and CEO of Hafezi Capital International Consulting and adjunct professor of the International Business Arts American University, Babak brings a wealth of experience that blends academic rigor with real-world impact. Babak, it's a privilege to have you on here. Welcome to the show once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was a mouthful.
That was a mouthful because your career is a handful.
No.
It's more than a handful, maybe a globe full because it's impacted the whole globe.
No.
Whoa,
It's good to have an impact, right? Ultimately, I think that we all live to make impact.
absolutely. That's the main goal. You know, I always tell people that I'd rather impact 1 billion lives than make $1 billion. because really that
100%.
is what legacy is about. But talking about the globe, right? It's interesting for us to know about globalization, and that's something that is very, very, what I say, important to you as well, given how your body of work has been able to
Mhm.
achieve global impact. I'd love for you to educate us about globalization and how it speaks to what we have been put together. Many thanks to Quoted, right? We talk about the China, US trade and industrialization policies. So let's start from globalization.
Yeah, I think one of the key elements of globalization, and I think one of the key reasons that we became so globalized, is because we lived in a world, pre-World War II, in a world that was very combative, where, friends and foes were always at war, and that
Mm,
it did not allow for economic development on a large scale, and it limited people. And it created a lot of instabilities, economically speaking. So we designed a system after World War II with the Bretton Woods Agreement to really integrate the world and create institutions. And this is the key word, institutions, to really be able to systemize and allow us to engage in trade. And that system became very America-centric early on in the 50s and 60s and all the way to about the early 70s. America was a big recipient and a winner of that because the factories around Japan and the European markets had disintegrated after World War II. And America was the only factory that was open for business. But then when competition started, when Japan came back to the market, when Europe came back to the market, it really created positive competition. And then in the late 70s, the beginning of the late 70s and early 80s, we have the financial behemoth, which is China, which back then was really nothing economically speaking. And they started becoming competitive in a global market sale. And in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, they became the manufacturing hub of the world. And we have seen massive dislodgements globally in terms of manufacturing jobs, in terms of economic growth in certain sectors. And so this has become a social a challenge. It started in economics, entered politics, and then now it's social. So it's impacting us on multi layers.
Socioeconomic. Wow. So, I remember doing my first degree in economics and being taught the theory of comparative advantage,
Right.
right? So there are sectors in which China, for example, has comparative advantage and
Mhm.
America has comparative advantage. The
Right.
basics in economics is a country should focus on the area wherein they have the comparative advantage, right? And buy from other countries, you know, products where they do not or they lack the comparative advantage, right? So bringing it to like a personal and individual level. But for me, growing up, I was talented at music and talented at speaking, but I always met people who were more talented musically. But I really did not meet people who were that talented as me speaking wise, and I decided to focus on speaking, right? So taking it back to America versus China, right? There's something that I love to see. Why hate when you can collaborate, right? So globalization has broken down the hitherto physical walls or physical barriers that we used to have prior to technological advancement. So what is your opinion on what really needs to be done, right? In order for US, China, the rest of the world to collaborate instead of hating. And, we have global economic prosperity.
So absolutely, the notion of comparative advantage is a critical notion in economics that is part and central. But you have to understand, economics is not always foreign policy, right? And this is where economics and foreign policy kind of go in two different critical ways. And in a sense that if you're a hegemonic power, like the United States is, and you want to maintain hegemonic power, economic coercion and economic power is critically important because that is what you need to force other countries into to be able to still remain powerful, right? I would argue that globalization can actually be divided into kind of six narratives. And those six narratives are kind of the establishment narrative, right? The establishment narrative is that what you're talking about, that comparative advantage is important. We win in certain industries, we lose in certain industries, but everybody wins in the process.
Mhm.
You also have this what's called the left-wing narrative, which is a win-lose situation. We have actually four win-lose situations, right? Depending on where on the political spectrum that you're in. And that is that the elites are the ones who are winning, right? That in this case of globalization, the elites are the winners and everybody else loses in the process. The third way is the corporate power narrative, which is the corporations win, especially multinational corporations win, at the expense of people. The right wing populist argument is that the people on the other side of the world in developing countries are winning against us, that we are losing in the process, right? And then again, still win lose. Then you have the geoeconomic narrative. This one is the one in economics, for us to maintain our competitive powers economically, that we need to diminish other people's economic powers. And we're becoming too reliant on others. And the last one is the global threat narrative, which is a lose-lose narrative, is that everybody loses in this, right? We're losing our jobs, we're losing our autonomy, we're losing all these different elements, and everybody else is, and then you don't have critical manufacturing domestically. You lose talents. So all of those are kind of the narratives. So those are the six narratives of globalization, and where you fall economically, where you fall sociopolitically, it impacts the way you see the world. And I wouldn't argue. And so the way you perceive it, the way where you see the world, impacts the policies you implement.
Absolutely.
And so think about it from a Brexit perspective, right? The Brexit perspective was to a certain degree a geoeconomic narrative that we don't want to give power up to the EU, that we want to have our own autonomy, that we want to grow internally, right? That was an argument. And we only be dominated by somebody else. So that geoeconomic is also a geopolitical argument. And that got intensified more after COVID. Like, if you think about what the impact of COVID and the inability for us to access materials easily globally because of supply chain disruptions, that really impacted our mental models per se of how we see the world. And that has kind of changed the narratives of how we see the world, and hence economics.
This is actually very true and a lot to unpack, right? The geoeconomics is looking at the way perspectives are aligned based off the geography. And you really can blame people for wanting to protect their territory because man is a social animal. Human beings
Mhm.
are territorial in nature. You identify with the territory in which you inhabit, right? To protect it. But a lot of times we cannot see the bigger picture. And that's why I say this. I've said this on the podcast before, that the capacity of a man is dependent on four E's, right? That is their education, their exposure, their experience, and their enlightenment.
Mhm.
And that is why we have platforms like this, to bring that enlightenment to help people understand the bigger picture, right? The first law of the jungle is self-preservation, but a lot of times you don't realize that being greedy and not looking out for others is counterintuitive in pursuing self-preservation. So I'd like for you to touch on that from an economic perspective and also weave in the industrial policies, right? China's industrial policies. How does industrial policies and instances of overproduction, e.g., in steel, solar, impact global markets and U.S.-based industries?
Right. So I think there's another element. There's an R missing in your word, which is risk. That humans are in generally not willing to take excess amount of risk, right? And when your livelihood is being threatened, that becomes the nasty the protectionism. It's how can I protect my industry? How can I protect my livelihood to the best? And then sometimes in that process of you thinking you're doing a good thing, you're actually creating more barriers for your
Mm-hmm,
sustainability, and you're
mm-hmm,
making yourself less competitive in the global market
mm-hmm.
space. And that's where human
Counterproductive,
correct,
counterintuitive.
exactly. So that is where we are, we're being challenged. So when we talk about, I think it's really important that we look at when we use the word China, we shouldn't look at it from a Chinese perspective in terms of a country, because many times in the West, when we use the word China, we think of the central government making these decisions, which if we look at it from a company perspective, it's not. It's actually much more distributed. There is no central authority in China that's setting policy in terms of in terms of business policy, right? What I mean by that is there's no person in the Chinese government that says, well, this is how much steel we're going to produce every single year, and this is what's happening. Very similar to what the USSR used to do. It doesn't exist per se. It is corporations. These are capitalistic corporations that have access to raw materials, so they have created infrastructures with the help of government, obviously, in sourcing raw products. Most of us are coming from emerging markets and frontier markets. So we're talking about Africa as a continent. We're talking about South America as a continent. That's where the raw commodities are coming from. So that's because they have that much capacity, they're producing to decrease the cost as much as they possibly can to remain globally competitive. And that's why you have overproduction in China. Now, in the early 2000s, you did have dumping, right? Where they brought things like tires into the US market, right? And they dumped it into the US market,
Don't forget
forcing domestic
Africa.
competitors.
Don't forget Africa.
100%, of course. But the problem with Africa is that institutions are weak, right? And because institutions are
Yeah.
weak, they cannot protect
Strong
against the mass.
individuals, weak institutions.
Correct. So because Africa, the African continent in general, does not have strong institutions to protect businesses, what ends up happening is the African economy suffers from it. But the U.S. was able to actually win, and they won in the case of tires in the United States. The problem, again, is the institutions are too weak. They were designed for the 1960s and 70s and 80s, or all the way to the 90s, but they're not designed for the 2000s where speed is critical. So when you take a case to the World Trade Organization, it may take 3, 4, 5, 6 years for it to be fully determined, right? By that time, any industry is dead. So we need to refine institutions, including the WTO, to showcase faster processes of enlightenment, of legal enlightenments and education. So that's really, really critically important. But unfortunately, what's happening is that our institutions are not keeping up with the rate of business, where business's speed has dramatically increased. And the institutions that are behind it are not keeping up. And it's creating massive gaps that's creating these uncertainties in the market. Industrial policy is being damaged in one way or the other. And delays are happening and job losses are happening.
Speaking of the speed keeps increasing over time, and we now have something that is very, very dear to my heart, linked to my government name, AI, artificial
Right.
intelligence. I often joke about it that it's like my parents saw something that other people did not see coming. My name is Ademola Isimeme, and why am I sharing the same initials as artificial intelligence? And artificial intelligence is something I have personally used, to build my media career, my company, and I see the speed of this large language models. I train AI models, and I see that speed at which they respond and adapt and innovate. It's really, really, would I say, alarming that the institutions that are meant to be protecting our interests, right, are not adapted to the times. So, like, what do we need to be saying to the policymakers? How do we need to drum this into their ears that if you don't speed up in terms of your adapting to what is happening, especially with AI in business, I think we're probably going to have another world war. I don't know. I think that's
So,
probably what's
I
going to
mean,
happen.
don't forget, both things can be true, right? Large learning models are extracting data from outside sources. So large language models, to a certain degree, are actually infringing on IP laws. Think about all the data that they're extracting to create the LLM models, right? Many of them are based on extraction of IP laws. So there's no protection on IP in that sense. One. Number two, what happens if an adversary wants to degrade our LLM and create content that is absorbed by our AI? So we don't have any systems around that either yet. So I think that we're in a completely blue ocean over here, and that there is no regulation. We don't know where we're going. And there could be massive social implications and challenges ahead of time. Remember that we had a different word for artificial intelligence up to about 3 or 4 years ago, and that was called machine learning. right? Machine learning was very systemized, was very, very, there were systems in place, but artificial intelligence has taken it to a different realm. And for example, things like landing an airplane, and flying an airplane, they have been part of the machine learning process for decades. We have ample amount of data, but because we have such refined data, because we have had so many issues that we were able to solve, because we know what the outliers are, what the anomalies are, where we're able to solve for that, we haven't had that right now with AI because it's on a massive scale, right? And I think that we're going to see massive amounts of legal issues and social issues that are going to come up that are in a negative way, so both positive but also in the negative way, that we have no legal protection from, which is going to be quite worrisome.
It's really crazy. How can you regulate something that you don't understand?
Well, this idea that we don't understand. I mean, think about it. For example, right now let's talk about artificial intelligence in autonomous driving cars. Right. As of right now, many insurance companies in the United States, if you get into an accident with an autonomous car, the automatic fault is on you, the human, and not on the machine. So what they're saying is the machine could not actually create an error. It is you that created the error. Right. So even our mental models around AI is still not refined correctly, and we're saying that the machine makes better choices than humans do, which in many cases they may, but it does. That's not totally true for all circumstances because the variables are different.
Absolutely.
So this idea that that's the way that we should go ahead and be is weird. So I think that the fact is, I think people do not understand and comprehend the totality of it. And rather than saying, listen, we're going to put this in a box and figure out how this plays in a box and then extract it to humanity in general, we have just unleashed it into humanity and say, let's figure it out and go along as we can and see what happens.
And that is freewheeling optimism. And freewheeling optimism can actually lead to so many undesired or
Right,
unwanted
right,
consequences and outcomes.
right, right.
We can only hope for the best. So let's talk about, the trade negotiations. Like, in your own view, how effective are current US-China trade negotiations at addressing long-term economic imbalances?
And the first thing I'm going to say is I don't think tariffs by their nature are bad. Let me explain what I mean. Is tariffs, if they're implemented cohesively and concurrently with a very well-designed foreign policy, can actually be very effective as a form of really creating change in the market, positive change in the market. And we have seen that throughout. We have, for example, sanctioned countries. Sanctions are also a form of tariffs, right? It's a restrictive trade policy as well. So you can see how sanctions can be effective in economic limitations and create increases in cost for certain countries. We've seen that in Iran. We're seeing that in Russia. So we've seen it in Myanmar. So we've seen those throughout history. And yes, they're not a panacea for regime change or for anything else, but economically speaking, they're pretty powerful in increasing domestic costs. But unfortunately, the current process of tariffs and the way they have been implemented by the U.S. are quite um, haphazard, I would argue, meaning that they actually do not achieve any real goal other than creating, a system of making America an antagonist against even its friends, even its allies, right? To have high tariffs against Canada, against Mexico, which are your key trading partners, against the European Union in general. It is honestly a repressive form of economic warfare that does not help in any meaningful way the U.S. economy. As a matter of fact, it decreases foreign direct investment into the United States. It creates massive uncertainty in terms of where the U.S. stands and what the policy is. And number three, it decreases innovation as well, because ultimately we need foreigners to invest in our country to increase innovation, because there's a lot of things that we do not know. And hence, foreign people bring new knowledge, new know-hows into the U.S. market. And that's the beauty of global trade, is that you bring different minds together and you create something completely new that you wouldn't do individually. So I think that the form and the methodology that has been imposed is actually creating a system which is making the U.S. less competitive globally and is making the U.S. less investable. And I don't believe that manufacturing is going to come back en masse to the United States. If it does, it's predominantly going to be automated manufacturing. It's going to be things that are that automation can handle much easier. So,
I agree
and
with you.
yeah, so automation is going to be the key element of job reduction in the US at a larger scale. And I'll give you, for example, one nuanced case. McDonald's right now is working on a process to limit the number of employees to about 3 to 4 employees per McDonald's. Everything is going to be all automated. So that's a lot of low income jobs that are going to be gone. And if McDonald's is doing it correct, if McDonald's is doing it, then all the other competitors have to do it as well to remain competitive and to regain pricing power. So ultimately, the machines are the one that have been the biggest evil in human history. It is not different colored people from different parts of the world. It is machines who are the biggest job destroyers in our livelihood. And honestly, artificial intelligence is going to make it even worse. So it's it's the extension of that machinery from steam into LLM that's going to completely change the way that we actually do work.
I hope I'm not going to get new enemies because of my initials AI. A lot of people already
No,
showing me hate. They're like,
no, no.
"Yo, AI, I heard you coming for our jobs." I'm not coming for your jobs. I'm here
Yeah.
to help you.
I mean, like, for example, the steel industry, right? 80, 90 years ago, it had 300,000 employees. Now you're running it with 20, 30,000 employees. You just don't need the issues. And even in cheap countries, like labor, in terms of labor compared to the developed world, right? Like China, um, Chinese are also using automation and it's creating less
Abs-
jobs in China, right? So
Absolutely,
this is not a purely, Western concept. It's a global concept.
it
So
is
this is
global, and they're not
yeah.
getting it. They're
No,
not getting
no,
it.
sadly,
You
they're
know,
not getting it.
when people ask me like, why are we losing jobs? Why are jobs being cut? I tell them just two words. Two words are the answer. Number one word is automation. Number two word is recession. There you go. I don't know.
Right.
Do you have an opposing view?
No, no, no. I would add another is lack of innovation. I think lack of
Mm,
innovation is another one, right? Because how do you produce new jobs, good jobs? It's innovation. It's new fields that it cannot be replicated in a cheaper country because the knowledge isn't there. The best example I'll give you is back in 2008, 2009, when the U.S. economy was hemorrhaging jobs, specifically in the car industry. There was a small little electronic car company called Tesla that was producing jobs and increasing jobs and creating a new market that didn't exist. Right. Whatever you think about politically from Elon Musk, let's put that aside. But from what he's done in creating a market in the U.S. that it was one of the hardest markets probably to enter. He did a fabulous job in entering that market and changing it and creating jobs, manufacturing jobs, when the auto industry in the U.S. was hemorrhaging jobs and went bankrupt because of it. Right. And that's a great example of where we need innovation. And innovation is a critical component to our growth, which means for innovation to happen, we need good education systems, not just at the college level, but from primary all the way to 12th grade, and then also into the college system and post bachelor system. So we need good education. It's critically important. Those are the kind of things and elements that we really need is innovation. That's what's going to create new industries. That's what's going to create new jobs and good quality jobs. One of the things that frustrates me so much is that we don't necessarily want our kids to go and work in a factory floor working 10, 15 hours, in a job that may not have a great quality of life. I mean, that was the point of growth and development is that we don't want to be in really, really dirty jobs, right? We want to be in clean educational jobs that we add value to society. I'm not diminishing the value of dirty jobs. They're critically important. But every parent wants their kids to have a better quality of life. So why are we regressing now? Why are we thinking that a regression is the model that's going to impact humanity in a positive way? And I think that's a big challenge.
it's actually very true. You know, dignity in labor is very,
Mhm.
very important, right? And nobody deserves to lose that dignity. I respect every job. You know, I say I respect hustle, people's hustles, as long as
100%.
it is legitimate, right?
Right.
Dirty hands make clean money.
100%. This is not an issue of degrading jobs, right? It's an issue of that as a society, we don't want everybody to be a farmer. That's why we moved from farming 400 years ago into now having different jobs. Otherwise, we could still be in farming. I mean,
But somebody has to do it.
no, 100%. I'm not diminishing farming, right? But I'm just saying that we have moved from farming because there are other jobs that are also that pay better, that have a higher quality of life, right? And even farming, think about how much technology plays in farming and that have created massive amounts of efficiencies. And we're not doing everything by hand anymore or with animals anymore. We're doing it with machines. And our yield curve has gone up dramatically in that. So it's a notion of innovation. And innovation is critically important to a better quality of life for all of us, number one. And number two, to also create new industries and new segments that will pay high quality jobs.
Mm. I love that word innovation. It's a word that is very, very dear to my heart. As a matter of fact, if you go onto my company's website, it reads where finance expertise meets tech and media innovation. So if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. I
Right.
love innovation because, like you rightly said, with innovation, you're able to um, execute blue ocean strategies, get
Hmm.
into uncontested market spaces, and create, new opportunities for yourself and for people, and create new livelihoods for people. I think I very much appreciate that perspective. But let's talk about the global supply chains. With the shifts in supply chain strategies, like how should businesses and policymakers think about diversification and resilience outside of China?
So I think that that has already happened. If we look at, for example, Walmart, one of the largest companies in terms of sales in the world, retail companies around the world. Walmart back in the 2000s, before the first Trump administration, their total exposure in procurement for products from China was somewhere in the 80 to 90th percentile, depending on the quarter. So about 80 to 90% of everything came from when it came to Walmart. Today, that number is about 60%, right? So it's a pretty large shift if you think about it from the largest retailer in the world. We are seeing this notion of shifts depending on what country you're from. If you're in the US, as an example, the shifts went from China to Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia. And so that's where the shifting happened. Also to Mexico, obviously, for the lower production price qualities, they shifted there. So we're seeing that the shifts are happening to other countries around the world. Another element of this is that the issue simultaneously is that because the U.S. system, the way that it's being run right now, is in silos, meaning that immigration is not aligned with trade policy. When you have a company like Hyundai, who is investing in is creating a factory and investing $4 billion in the U.S., and they are about 6 months before opening, and they send their engineers to train everybody, and then ICE picks all the engineers up, puts them in handcuffs, and jails them without water, and then that creates a massive economic imbalance, risks that were not there before. So if you're looking for foreign direct investment into the US and manufacturing into the US, your immigration policy and every single other vertical has to align to be able to allow for that. You cannot say you need to invest $4 billion into the US, but you cannot have any of your employees come over here and train people. That just can't happen, right? So you cannot have one without the other. You need everything to be aligned. So when it comes to policies, we are not running cohesive, structured policies. Now, one of the key elements that kind of COVID implemented is that it taught us that we need to rethink cost versus security, meaning that this competitive advantage notion was that we have to go to the cheapest country around the world. I think that COVID showed us that no longer should go to the cheapest country in the world. We need to go to the securest country in the world where we can make sure that we have good relations with them and we can extract and do things whenever we need to. So we are in this process of going through what we call a reestablishment of production autonomy, right? That's kind of in the process that we're going through. And I think it's a very healthy thing. I think that that's going to obviously increase costs. So we're probably going to be in an environment where inflation is going to be continuous. And the reasoning is because we went from the lowest production country in the world to now going to the securest country in the world. And that obviously is going to have inflationary elements built into it until we can create mass scale, until we can create structures that enable price decreases. But in the short term, we're going to be there. And then also, I think we're trying to reestablish who do we want to deal with? Are their values congruent with ours? Believe there. That's where we're figuring where we are. We're assessing where our trade policy is. And I think that's where we find ourselves, both in the EU, in the UK, in North America. That's where we are right now. Obviously, if we look at the BRICS, they are looking at it very differently. From the BRICS perspective is how can we make sure that the powerful countries that we have been dealing with, who in many times were our colonizers, how do we create independence from them and allow ourselves to actually run our economic policy without dependency on them in terms of economic policy, in terms of trade policy, in terms of banking. So where can we create systems where we can, in a sense, front run them or circumvent them if they decide not to work with us? And I think that's where BRICS is becoming the powerful player there.
That block of countries with, would I say, strong economic power on a global scale. So just for the layman, I think the BRICS countries, we're looking at Brazil, Russia, India, and who else?
China, and then
China,
South Africa. South
Korea.
Africa has been added.
Yeah, Korea,
No,
South
South. There's no Korea.
Oh,
Korea
sorry,
has not been added.
there's no K. Right, China
There's no
and
case.
South Africa, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're
South
looking at
Africa,
how many countries here? BRICS, right?
Yes, but we have others that have joined as well. For example, Iran has joined them. North Korea has joined them.
Oh,
So
wow.
we have, so yeah. So this BRICS is the acronym for the it's a
The
1980s
founding
acronym
countries.
for the biggest countries of its growth, but they have been expanded now to include other countries as well.
So, like, from a global economy perspective, right? For the audience to be able to understand the implication of decisions made by BRICS, on the global economy. So if you're looking at from a percentile or percentage perspective, what percentage of the global economy the BRICS are block?
They're somewhere between the 30 to 40% of the global economy, right? They're pretty substantial, large amount of economy. They're also growing rapidly. Some of them are very raw commodity focused. So think about Brazil as an example, heavily raw commodity. South Africa,
Brazil
heavily
is
raw commodity, right? Russia, heavy raw commodity, and then China is manufacturing, has less raw commodities, right? India has some raw commodities in some natural resources, but also, again, very similar to China, the next manufacturing hub there, right? And it's the secondary implications, what we call second derivatives, are all the contracts and negotiations that can go into developing blocks that allow trade to decrease, the frictions of trade to decrease between countries. And I think that that's exactly what BRICS is doing, is how can we create systems within our existing network of countries to decrease the friction of trade between us and to also limit the choke points that countries in the West could have. For example, choke points on banking, right? Think about that. This idea that everything has to be determined into dollars first before it clears into the system. If we circumvent that, then the US loses a certain type of hegemony and the dollar uses a certain type of value. And that's what they're working on right now, is how they can go ahead and limit the issues around that. Is how can we go ahead and trade directly within our currencies without converting it into either euros or dollars.
So from an automation perspective now, how has industrialization and technology, right, reshaped that industrial landscape globally, and what is the role of the BRICS in this power play?
Well, they are, I mean, that's where the raw commodity comes from. I mean, every single cell phone manufactured starts somewhere in the African continent, right? Because that's where the raw commodities are. When you talk about raw commodities, that's where they come from. And they need to be taken away, away from, think about this. a small piece of metal of some sort, be it gold, silver, whatever it is extracted from somewhere in Africa, moved, by truck to a port, maybe transferring from anywhere from Nigeria all the way to Djibouti, to be able from Djibouti to be placed on a boat to travel to China, and then to be redeveloped into a part of a chip, right? So this entire supply chain is dependent on raw commodities. So how can you speed up industrialization? How can you speed up manufacturing of chips? How can you speed up the manufacturing of natural products that go into what we call intermediary products that go into larger products? How can you all do that systematically? And if we look at China, for example, one of the numbers I saw was they control about 90% of rare earth mineral development and about 60% of the raw aspects of it. So they have a monopoly of rare earth minerals. And that's what goes entirely into modern technology. Everything from missiles that we use to bomb, those parts go into there, all the way to your newest iPhone. So that is necessary. That is a necessary tool, and China has been very, very good at creating monopolistic powers, both on the raw side as well as on the industrialization side. Which again, if we move that towards security, you see how that becomes kind of critically
Mm-hmm.
important for
Very critical.
hegemonic powers to create resilience against that.
Yeah, and of course, from a broader global impact perspective, what are the broader implications of the US-China trade relations for international trade policy, geopolitics, and of course the global economy at large?
Well, the way it's looking right now, and if we move forward, and I think that this is where it's going, everybody's talking about a multipolarity, where we're going to go back from a one unified system of global trade to a multipolar system of global trade, where varying hegemonic powers, regional hegemonic powers, are going to go into different segments and trading blocks. And so that we're going to see a multipolarity. I don't believe in the multipolarity argument. I think that one of the things in trade is the larger the systems are, the better it is. So I believe that we're probably most likely going to go into bipolar model. And we may go into multipolar at the beginning and then eventually go into bipolar model. And the bipolar model is going to be an American-led system of global trade, meaning that the American system will be American banking institutions, American economic and political institutions, and dollar-based trade. And we're going to go most likely in a Chinese-based model of international trade, which is based on, not necessarily on the RMB, because I don't think China wants to actually make the RMB a global market, because there's a lot of issues domestically that creates and allows for, for flight of capital outside of China. So they may use a BRICS currency, a secondary currency, to be able to achieve that and protect their domestic currency. And so we most likely will see a BRICS style or a secondary currency that will challenge it. So we may have more integration between the EU, the UK, and the US, and Canada, and Mexico. And then we're going to have a bipolarization of the world with China and many of the developing markets joining them. And so the question from a global perspective is, what do you do if you're Saudi Arabia, as an example? So Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner is China. 18% of Saudi oil is sold to China. It's its largest partner in terms of oil. Whereas militaristically, you are based into the US, but economically, you're dependent on China. Which one will you choose? Right. So those are the
That is an
arguments that.
ethical dilemma.
No, those are the questions that you're going to have. Or, for example, a country like Mongolia, right? A country like Mongolia, which is trapped between Russia and China, but it prefers to look to Washington for economic, liberty. So, what do you do when you're those countries? When you do so, this is the challenge of the next multipolarity system. These are the elements which countries will have to decide based on their own self-interest and motivations by the different blocks to entice them to come and join their system. And so we're going to see a reshaping of the global system. It's one of those once in a lifetime shifts. The same way that I talked about the Bretton Woods system, how critical that was in reshaping global economic policy. I think this next move is going to be one of those. It's going to impact our next global economic policy for at least 50 to 100 years.
Interesting stuff. So let's look into the future, right? If you were advising the U.S. government or multinational CEOs today, C-suite executives, what strategies would you recommend to navigate these uncertainties around the U.S.-China trade relations?
So one of the things, in the short term, it's really hard, right? In the short term, it's very, very hard because you don't know what's happening. If you wake up one morning and then you have another tariff, like for example, over the weekend, we woke up to in the US having new tariffs on pharmaceutical products, as an example, or kitchen cabinets. So right now, it's exceptionally hard to kind of do anything because you have to assume that eventually they'll get to your industry and sector in terms of tariffs. So the question becomes, what do you do outside of the US? Right now, the powers of most of these organizations is outside of the US because it's much more stable, right? So I think that what you do is you have to create outside entities, and you have to create those outside entities you need to use those outside entities as a means of trading and also creating relationships with the regional governments there, saying that just because of this is from a corporate perspective, just because of the government is doing A, B, and C, we as company A do not believe necessarily in the same policies, and we would like to still be heavily invested here, and then maybe not trade with the U.S., but to trade with other markets that we're in. It's important to understand that 60%, 60% of the S&P 500 brings its money from outside of the US. So they're selling outside the US. So global sales for US corporations are critically important. Critically important. So we cannot walk away from that. That has become so it becomes to look outside of the US versus in the US. Once we have much more clarity and we know what the policy is and that it's not going to change every weekend, that's when we can start looking domestically as to what to do then. And how do we reshape those relationships that we have created externally with the ones that we have domestically, right? We also have to look at resiliency in terms of what other supply chains and where else we can move our supply chains fairly quickly. So creating options A through Z in terms of countries and identifying production facilities outside will become critically important, just so we know where we can go to just in case of tariffs are implemented. And number three is how can we use arbitrage as it comes out to minimizing the tax liabilities. So we know that we have tax liabilities from 125% all the way to 10%. How can we use arbitrage to minimize the cost and move it to countries that are much more efficient in terms of tariff policy? So those are the elements that we have to go through. And that's what most corporations right now are going through. Unfortunately, by the time they go through it, it may be null and void because there's a very strong chance, very, very strong chance that most of these tariff policies are going to be deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. We already have two courts in the United States that have said that they're unconstitutional. We're waiting for it to go to the Supreme Court next, and there's a very strong chance, somewhere between a 60 to 80% chance the Supreme Court will say the same thing. So if that happens, then we're back to point zero, right, on
Score one.
tariffs. Exactly. But the issue is that one thing about this administration is that they're consistently looking for other small points to go after. So just because this one is deemed unconstitutional, it does not mean they have 3 or 4 other things that they can go implement. And then it will have to go through the judiciary system, and will take another a year and a half to 2 years to be figured out. And so we may be in a different dilemma, same dilemma, different circumstances in the next 18 months. So that's why holding tight and not investing domestically is going to be probably the smartest policies right now. Also, domestic manufacturing, you cannot base your domestic manufacturing on a 1 to 5 year timeline. You're generally looking at a 10 to 30-year timeline for this. So you cannot repatriate everything and create things domestically if you do not have clarity on that. So those are all the issues that you have. And obviously, every corporation has its own sub-issues because how they manage the organization, how they manage the supply chain, all those actually implement differences and striations in implementation. So those are all the elements that we got to take a look at.
I'll say follow the money trail. He who pays
Right.
the piper dictates the tune. So
Right.
I hope that parable sounds just about right. Wow. So thank you very much again for being on the show. I have to close this with the 5 question quickfire round. Are you ready to rumble?
Let's see what happens.
Okay, so the number one question: what's one book that has profoundly shaped your thinking on business and leadership?
It wasn't a book. It was a class that I took in system dynamics, and it is a system dynamics book, right? And it is it was a great book, and it was a great class that I took, and it was all about how to think outside of the general notions of black and white and to look at the gray area. I think that we
I
live
love that.
more in gray matter than we live in the black and white. And I think that that was the system dynamics class, and the book was the most critical part of how it changed my perspective of life.
Mm. Interesting. I love that. It's quite documented. I always talk about thinking outside of the box. But who wrote that book? So we can have that book in the description
It was
section.
Professor Sherman. Professor Sherman, I think, wrote the book.
Okay, well, we'll find it out. We'll keep it in the
It's a very,
description
very
section.
thick college book, but the plethora of stories that it has
Mm.
on mental models, on how we see the world and how we structure the world, and how that impacts our cognitive and how cognitive biases impact our perspective of life, really,
Mhm.
really is absolutely amazing.
I love that you mentioned the cognitive biases because I have identified that in quite a number of people and tell
Mm,
them, do you realize that you're actually making decisions based on a cognitive bias? But
right,
people cannot see it. A very good example is the recency bias. You're making a decision based on recency bias. You should
right,
know that because that's the last item that was that had an impression on your mind, and that's why you think that is the best, but that is not necessarily the best. So
right.
I think it is in a time we need to learn to be, would I say, unbiased, neutral, in order to be able to make, better informed decisions. Thank you very much for that one. Okay, so the next one is if you could give one piece of advice to your 25-year-old self, what would it be?
So I always tell my students, if you're not growing, you're dying. And what I
Mm,
mean by that is that if you're not learning every single day something new, you're falling behind and you're becoming you're left behind, right? Think about going back 3, 4, 5,000 years, when we were trying to fight for food every single day, right? The difference between living and dying is people who, they tried new things, and if they found different foods to eat that were nutritious. They found different ways of actually engaging in warfare to be able to hunt and to eat, right? That was all about learning. So if you're not learning, you're dying.
I love that survival of the fittest. There is a proverb. We are come from Nigeria. In Yoruba land, they say that the day we die is the day we rest. That
Eh,
learning is a lifelong exercise, right? You keep learning every day, and the
every
day you
single
stop
day.
learning is the day you die. Interesting stuff. So coffee, tea, or something stronger, what fuels your work days?
So I'm very biased towards coffee. Very, very biased towards coffee. To the point that one of my students actually opened up a coffee shop and I joined him in the process. So I am very biased towards coffee. And yes, there's nothing more refreshing. Listen, I come from a Middle Eastern tea drinking establishment. A good tea always hits the spot. But a good latte is also amazing.
Okay. Cheers. Cheers to that. Okay, so which country or culture has influenced your worldview the most and why?
Um, so I'm a so I grew up. I'm an Iranian who fled Iran because of the revolution. We went to Austria. I grew up in Austria. I grew up in, and then from there we ended up moving to Spain. From Spain we ended up moving to Australia. From Australia to the United States, and then I went to boarding school in Madrid. I believe that every single country in the world, has an amazing way of reshaping and shaping us. So every touch point with every country for me is an awakening as a person, is an awakening in terms of learning, and it's also seeing the world from a different perspective. It also sheds discrimination Because as you see the world, as you see how other people live, as you humanize everybody else in the process, it allows you to really see that we are 99.9% the same, right? As humans, our differentiating factors in our DNA is minimal. So I don't want to say there's one country because it's not true. It's every country, right? Every country, every touch point, every background, every form of learning makes me more complete as a human. And it makes me see the world from a different perspective, which I think is the beauty of life. That there's no one true sense. It's the multiple sense, the multi-layered sense. And that how every single other person lives their life is a natural, beautiful thing. And for us to be in their shoes, to live it is what makes us human. That empathy.
Well, I love that. I love that. It's interesting how you mentioned a couple of countries, Austria, Spain. We are on the Apple top 100 charts in Spain, in Austria.
Beautiful.
I think in India, in Poland. I think we're number 17 in Poland today, number 5 in Zimbabwe, top 100 in quite a number of countries. It's quite interesting. And you think about it, even in Saudi Arabia as well, being top 100, it speaks to what you're
Yeah,
saying.
100%.
People
And
enjoy
yeah, I mean,
educational information.
100%. I think that one of the things that, and one of the things that I always thought is, oh, I'm educated. I will not fall for propaganda. And sometimes you realize, wow, you really fell for the propaganda,
You
right?
fell for that
You
thing.
really fell for that, right? Your biases are really, really bad.
Mhm.
And when you go to foreign countries and you see what's on the ground versus everything you have been fed, you start realizing, wow, there's a huge difference. And that's why I love traveling. That's why I love seeing people for who they
Yeah,
are, not to be informed by others in the process.
exactly. Exactly. I learned that, quite interestingly. Have some countries that I'm from Africa. The way
Yeah.
people, especially the Western world, paint some African countries, they're like,
Oh,
"Excuse me, have you been
100%.
have you been there? Have you seen what is on ground?" Like, it's a deeper reality. So say less and go there and find out by yourself. Wow.
I mean, no, they'd love to put Africa like the 1984 Ethiopian famine crisis. And that's the
I am
mental
telling you.
model that Africa lives in, sadly, right? They have not seen the level of wealth of
Mhm.
Lagos, of Casablanca, of Rabat,
I'm telling you.
Alexandria. So they haven't seen the level of development that has happened. And then what happens is that's the issue, right? When you have good leadership and when you have good institutions that are redeveloping the country, and then where the West is not investing in that, and then you start traveling there and you see their airports are better than our airports,
I'm
there's
telling
an issue. There's a massive issue.
I'm telling you, was it 2 years ago? I was in Morocco and I had a good
Yeah.
time. I'm like, okay, wow,
Yes.
interesting.
Yes. Exactly.
Wow. So it's quite interesting. I think people should travel more and, you find
100%.
out, you find out more by traveling more. Last year I was in Lithuania and someone was asking like, what did you go to do in Lithuania? Okay. I'm like, okay, I got this. I got this from Lithuania,
Nice.
very
Were you in
fantastic
Vilnius?
country.
Were you in Vilnius?
Yeah,
Were
I
you
was
in
in Vilnius.
Vilnius?
I was in
No.
Vilnius. I was in Kaunas as well.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful country area. Yeah.
Beautiful place, beautiful place. And of course, you've got Estonia. You've also got
Right.
Latvia as well. Like,
Correct.
amazing place, amazing people. But people only want to travel to the popular places. I'm not moved by the popular places.
So I think that that's changing, right? Especially with, like, for example, we talked about before we came on, the depreciation of price of cost of travel. Think about that, how much that has changed, right?
Mhm.
From the 70s until the 80s, the price of travel has substantially decreased. The quality has also decreased to a certain degree, but the accessibility of traveling, right? For a person to pay 16, 17 pounds and to travel from, one of the airports in London to anywhere in Europe, it's pretty amazing. So, but the point is, don't go to Ibiza. Choose other markets.
Now you're tempting me. You're tempting me to call out to airlines. You're tempting me. Anyways,
Yeah.
I'm gonna call them out. I'm gonna call them out.
Don't call them out. They could become partners. They could become
Yeah,
partners.
yeah. EasyJet and Ryanair,
Right.
please, you guys can do better, right? You guys can do better. And of course, please, you can become partners.
Exactly. We'll do our next podcast from their aircraft. How about that?
That would be great. That would be
Yes.
fantastic.
Yes.
I need to play. I need a seat in what's it called, in business class. But the crazy thing is, I think a lot of EasyJet and Ryanair flights don't even have a business class. So how do you do that?
No, they don't. They don't. They don't.
Okay, so let me call my preferred partner. British Airways, where you at? What's up, British
Yeah.
Airways? I think British Airways was the very first business class flight I ever had. I did have a good time with them. So guys, I spent my money on you guys, so it's time for you guys to spend your money on me. I'm
Exactly.
calling you guys.
Exactly.
Come sponsor the
Exactly.
podcast and first let us have our next episode. Myself and Babak Hafezi on the British Airways. I'm calling it now, and of course, you guys, I'll get to tag you. So, the last question right here is: what's one quote or mantra you live by that our listeners can take away today?
So one of the things I teach a class on learning from failure, right?
Mm,
And anything related to failure, I think it's wonderful. I think that ultimately failure is what allows humans to good failure, intelligent failures, allows us to really become better at what we are.
mm,
So to me, again, it goes back to this notion: if you're not trying new things and learning new things every single day, that you are falling behind and you're dying and you're failing. So that to me is the mantra of life: is try new things. Don't be, learn, research as much as you can. Learn what others, where others have failed and why,
mm,
and then try. If it's a really, really big risk, try in small portions, and then as you become successful and learn, scale. So that's kind of the mantra of my life: is you are ever evolving, you're ever learning, the market is changing on you. And the only way you can become competitive is really to understand where the market is and where you are and how you can finesse yourself and become the best version of yourself.
I love that absolutely. This is a man that aligns with my philosophies. I really appreciate you, and of course, I always love to say it, an attitude of gratitude is good attitude, and when a person shares their time with you, they share their life with you because the SI unit of veteran life is time. So once again, thank you very much. I love and respect to you,
Thank
to the
you.
audience, to the audience. Conceive, believe, strive to thrive, and achieve. For me, it's goodbye. Brett from Babak. Do you want to leave a shout out to anybody, and who do you want to say goodbye to?
I just wanted to say that the world's inclusive, an inclusive world is better than an exclusive world. So let's strive to bring everybody in and make everybody live a better life.
Wow. Thank you very much. And of course, guys, it's goodbye for me.